The faded ink on the old man's forearm looked like a cheap, drunken mistake, and the loud mouths in the diner made sure everyone knew it. They laughed, calling him a fraud. But their smirks vanished the second a four-star general walked in, locked eyes with the old man, and rolled up his own sleeve. The rain in Fayetteville, North Carolina, had a way of washing the color out of the world, leaving behind a damp, gray chill that seeped straight into the bones. For 81-year-old Harrison Caldwell, the ache in his joints was just another morning alarm clock. He sat in his usual corner booth at Mitchell's Diner, a faded establishment that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee bacon grease and lingering regrets. Harrison was a quiet fixture at Mitchell's. He wore the same faded red flannel shirt, the cuffs rolled up precisely to his elbows, revealing forearms that looked like they had been carved from weathered oak. His hands, resting flat on the Formica tabletop, bore the map of a hard life knuckles, swollen with arthritis skin, paper-thin and spotted with age, yet possessing a heavy, quiet stillness. But it was his left forearm that invariably drew stares. Right below the crook of his elbow sat a tattoo. To the untrained eye, it was an eyesore. It was a crude, distorted skull, missing its lower jaw, hovering over the jagged numbers 041. The ink had long ago surrendered its crisp black lines, bleeding outward over the decades, into a bruised, watery blue. It looked like the kind of amateur work done with a sewing needle and a bottle of India ink in the back of a dimly lit county lockup. It was ugly. It was scarred. It was a relic. The diner bell chimed, slicing through the low murmur of the morning rush. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air, and a trio of men in their mid-20s. They were loud, practically vibrating with unearned confidence. Leading the pack was Braden, a muscular man stuffed into a tight olive-drab t-shirt that screamed performative patriotism. He had a perfectly manicured beard, expensive sunglasses resting on the back of his neck, and an aura of arrogance that demanded the entire room's attention. Braden and his friends Kyle and Wyatt slid into the booth directly across the narrow aisle from Harrison. They were boisterous, slapping the table, laughing at inside jokes, and loudly discussing their recent tactical training weekend. They spoke in loud staccato bursts about operator mindsets and sheepdogs, throwing around military jargon they had clearly learned from YouTube videos rather than the mud of a trench. Harrison kept his slate-grey eyes fixed on the black coffee in front of him. He had seen thousands of boys like Braden in his 81 years, boys who thought volume equated to toughness. He took a slow sip of his coffee, ignoring them entirely. But Braden's restless eyes were scanning out the diner, looking for an audience, looking for someone to assert dominance over. His gaze landed on the quiet old man in the corner. More specifically, it landed on Harrison's exposed left forearm. Braden nudged Kyle, pointing a thick finger openly at Harrison's arm. "Hey, check it out," Braden said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like we've got a hardened criminal in our midst. Or a guy who lost a bet in a trailer park." Wyatt leaned over the table, squinting. "Man, that is rough. Looks like my 4-year-old drew it with a dying Sharpie." The three of them erupted into harsh, braying laughter. Several patrons in the diner turned to look, their faces flashing with mild discomfort, but no one spoke up. People rarely did when confronted with loud, aggressive young men. Cassidy, the diner's middle-aged waitress with a no-nonsense demeanor and a pot of decaf in her hand, marched over to Braden's table. She had known Harrison for 10 years. She knew he lived alone, tipped exactly 20%, and never complained if his eggs were cold. She slammed the coffee pot down on Braden's table, making the ceramic mugs rattle. "You boys need to keep your voices down and mind your own business," Cassidy snapped, her eyes flashing with maternal fury. "Or you can take your breakfast somewhere else." Braden held up his hands in mock surrender, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just admiring the artwork. just making an observation about the local flavor. Cassidy opened her mouth to tear into him, but a raspy, gravelly voice stopped her. Let it be Cass. Harrison hadn't looked up. He hadn't shifted in his seat. He merely spoke the words into his coffee mug, but the quiet authority in his tone was absolute. Cassidy hesitated, her jaw tight, before giving Braden one last withering glare and marching back behind the counter. Braden watched her go, then turned his attention fully to Harrison. The old man's refusal to engage didn't placate Braden. It infuriated him. To a bully, silence isn't a truce. It's a provocation. Braden leaned back in his vinyl booth, stretching his arms wide. His right arm was covered in a pristine, full-sleeve tattoo. It was a masterpiece of modern ink, hyper-realistic Spartans, a tattered American flag waving in the wind, and polished dog tags, all shaded perfectly, with thousands of dollars worth of professional artistry. "Hey, old-timer," Braden called out, a mocking lilt in his voice. "If you're going to walk around with ink, you might want to get a cover-up. That thing is an insult to the art. You do that yourself in the clink." Harrison finally lifted his head, his eyes framed by deep, weathered creases locked onto Braden. There was no anger in those eyes. There was no fear. There was only a cold, abyssal emptiness that made Kyle and Wyatt momentarily drop their smiles, but Braden was too insulated by his own ego to notice the danger in the old man's gaze. "It serves its purpose," Harrison said quietly, his voice like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "What purpose is that?" Braden sneered, leaning forward. "Reminding you of the time you got drunk in Tijuana. Because let me tell you, man, out here we respect real ink, real meaning." He tapped his own bicep. "This sleeve cost me $3,000 in Atlanta. Took 40 hours. Represents the warrior spirit. You know anything about that old man? Or are you just one of those guys who pretends he was tough back in the day?" Harrison looked at Braden's arm. He looked at the perfect, painless art. Then he looked down at his own faded, scarred skin. The number 041, a skull missing a jaw. "It cost more than money, son," Harrison said softly. "And it wasn't bought in a parlor." Braden let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter, looking back at his friends as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" He slid out of his booth and took 2 steps across the narrow aisle, towering over Harrison's table. "Oh, I get it," Braden said, his voice dripping with condescension, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "You're one of those guys, a wannabe. You got a scratch on your arm so you can sit at the end of the bar and tell fairy tales to whoever will buy you a beer. Let me guess you were a secret agent, a sniper. You know stolen valor is a crime, Grandpa. It disrespects guys who actually put in the work." The silence in Mitchell's diner was deafening. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The cook in the back had paused over the grill. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Harrison Caldwell did not flinch. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand, picked up a paper napkin, and carefully wiped his mouth. He looked up at Braden, who was standing over him like a judge, waiting to hand down a sentence. "I don't drink beer anymore," Harrison stated flatly. "And I don't tell stories." "Because you don't have any," Braden countered, leaning down, placing both his hands on the edge of Harrison's table, invading the old man's space. "Look at you. You're a relic. And that ink on your arm is garbage. It's an insult to guys who actually understand sacrifice." Outside, the steady rhythm of the Fayetteville rain was suddenly broken by a deep, powerful hum. It wasn't the sound of a passing delivery truck or a local commuter. It was the synchronized heavy rumble of high-performance engines. Through the rain-streaked front windows of the diner, patrons watched as 2 massive matte black Chevrolet Suburbans pulled aggressively into the gravel parking lot. They didn't park in designated spaces. They pulled up parallel to the diner's entrance, completely boxing in Braden's lifted, heavily decaled pickup truck. Braden frowned temporarily, distracted from his harassment. "Hey, what the hell, those guys are blocking me in." Before Braden could march to the door to protest, the heavy doors of the Suburbans swung open simultaneously. 4 men stepped out into the pouring rain. They were built like linebackers, wearing dark, tailored suits with earpieces coiling down their necks. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that instantly commanded the space. 2 of them took positions at the diner's entrance, while the other 2 held the doors wide open. Then a 5th man stepped out. The diner collective held its breath. The man was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing an immaculate, perfectly tailored army service uniform. The dark blue fabric was spotless. The gold buttons gleamed even in the dreary light, and a blinding array of ribbons and medals adorned his chest, creating a vibrant tapestry of commendations. But it was what rested on his shoulders that sucked the oxygen out of the room. 4 silver stars. General Nathaniel Reed, commander of the United States Army Forces Command, stepped out of the rain and into Mitchell's diner. The atmosphere in the room shifted so violently it was almost physical. Fayetteville was a military town. Nearly everyone inside the diner knew exactly what those 4 stars meant. They understood the sheer, incomprehensible weight of a 4-star general. This wasn't a local commanding officer. This was one of the most powerful military leaders on the planet, a man whose signature moved fleets, commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, and altered the geopolitical landscape of the world. General Reed paused just inside the doorway. His sharp, hawk-like eyes scanned the room. The 2 men in suits flanked him, their hands clasped in front of them, their eyes scanning the patrons for threats. Braden stood frozen at Harrison's table. His arrogant smirk had completely evaporated, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed look of absolute shock. As a military enthusiast, Braden recognized General Reed instantly. He had seen the man on the news giving briefings at the Pentagon. Braden instinctively stood up straighter, his chest puffing out slightly, his hands falling to his sides. In his delusional mind, he wondered if the general was here for a local PR event, maybe stopping in to greet the citizens. Braden prepared himself to offer a crisp, respectful nod. General Reed ignored the mayor of Fayetteville, who happened to be sitting in a booth by the window. He ignored the local police chief, picking up a coffee to go. He ignored Braden walking past the young man, as if he were nothing more than a piece of uninteresting furniture. The general's eyes were locked on the back corner booth. The heavy rhythmic thud of Reed's polished dress shoes echoed on the linoleum floor. The entire diner watched in stunned silence as the 4-star general marched down the narrow aisle, coming to a sudden rigid halt right next to Braden, but facing Harrison Caldwell. Braden held his breath, expecting the general to reprimand the old man, maybe noticing the stolen valor tattoo that Braden had been so loudly condemning. Instead, General Nathaniel Reed, a man who answered only to the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States, snapped his heels together. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet diner. He straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand in a salute so crisp, so perfect, and so laden with profound respect that it made Cassidy, the waitress, gasp aloud. Reed held the salute, his eyes locked on the hunched, quiet old man in the faded flannel shirt. "Sergeant Major," General Reed said. His voice, usually accustomed to booming across briefing rooms, was thick with an emotion that bordered on reverence. Harrison Caldwell looked up from his cold coffee. He didn't stand, he didn't smile. He merely looked at the 4-star general with those ancient slate-gray eyes and gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. "Nathaniel," Harrison rasped quietly. "You're blocking the light." The entire diner seemed to tilt on its axis. Braden's jaw went slack. Kyle and Wyatt looked as though they were going to be sick. A 4-star general had just saluted, an 81-year-old man in a dirty flannel shirt, and the old man had addressed the general by his first name. General Reed slowly lowered his hand from the salute. A warm, genuinely affectionate smile broke through his stern, battle-hardened features. "My apologies, Caldwell," Reed said softly. He glanced down at the table, noticing the 2 empty mugs Braden had left, and the general hostility lingering in the air. The general's eyes flicked to Braden. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a gaze so cold and terrifying it made Braden physically take a step backward, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. "Is there a problem here, son?" General Reed asked Braden. The volume of his voice was low, but it carried the lethal, coiled energy of a strike waiting to happen. Braden swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. His expensive, colorful sleeve suddenly felt ridiculous, like a child's temporary tattoo. No, sir," Braden stammered, his bravado entirely crushed under the sheer, suffocating gravity of the general's presence. "No problem at all. We were just leaving." "I suggest you do," Reed said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And I suggest you walk quietly." Braden didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his jacket, shoved past his terrified friends, and practically sprinted for the door, head down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Kyle and Wyatt scrambled after him, the diner door swinging shut behind them, leaving a profound, charged silence in their wake. General Reed turned his attention back to Harrison. Without asking for permission, the commander of hundreds of thousands of soldiers slid into the booth opposite the old man, completely indifferent to the fact that his immaculate dress uniform was now resting on cracked, duct-taped vinyl. He leaned forward, looking at Harrison's left forearm. He looked at the blurred numbers. 041. He looked at the faded skull. "They don't know, do they?" Reed asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the tattoo. Harrison slowly pulled his arm back, resting his hands in his lap. "No one knows, Nate. That was the whole point, wasn't it?" General Reed nodded slowly. He reached up, unbuttoning the cuff of his left sleeve. The men in the dark suits standing by the door shifted uncomfortably. They had guarded the general for years and had never seen him undress in public. But Reed didn't care. He meticulously rolled the crisp blue fabric of his uniform up his forearm, past his wrist, past his elbow. When the general laid his arm on the table next to Harrison's, the patrons of Mitchell's diner leaned in their eyes wide. There on the pristine, unblemished skin of the 4-star general was a tattoo. It wasn't a sprawling eagle or a patriotic slogan. It was a skull missing its lower jaw, and beneath it, rendered in fading decades-old ink, were the numbers 041. Cassidy, standing completely still behind the glass pie display, accidentally dropped her wiping cloth. It hit the linoleum floor with a soft slap, the absolute only sound in a room that had seemingly forgotten how to breathe. The identical crude tattoos, one resting on the weathered, spotted arm of a forgotten old man, the other resting proudly on the pristine skin of a 4-star general, told an impossible story that defied all logic and expectation. General Nathaniel Reed traced the faded ink on his own forearm with a slow, deliberate thumb. "You know, Caldwell." Reed murmured the commanding, booming baritone of his voice, suddenly softened by an immense wave of nostalgia. "They offered to touch this up for me at the Pentagon. Some hotshot tattoo artist wanted to make it look professional for the press briefings. I told him if he came within 10 feet of my arm with a needle, I'd have him guarding a frozen radar station in Thule, Greenland." Harrison offered a faint, raspy chuckle. It was a sound like dry rocks grinding together. "Should have let him, Nate. The ink was terrible from the start. Doc Henderson was half drunk on cheap, smuggled whiskey when he did it. Doc was always half drunk, Reed replied, a deeply sad smile touching the corners of his mouth. But his hands were steady when it mattered. He never missed a vein, and he never lost a man. The diner patrons, previously engrossed in their morning pancakes and trivial daily gossip, were completely immobilized. They were eavesdropping on living history. The tattoo was not a gang sign, nor was it a drunken, regrettable mistake made in a dirty trailer park. It was the unofficial insignia of Task Force 041, a highly classified, off-the-books, long-range reconnaissance patrol unit that operated deep behind enemy lines during the darkest, most brutal and unacknowledged chapters of the Cold War. They were ghosts. They were men who were officially listed as missing or assigned to mundane clerical duties in Germany on paper, while actually executing missions so sensitive, so dangerous, that their success or failure would never be officially documented by the United States government. The jawless skull represented their absolute, unbreakable vow, speak no evil. They would take their mission secrets to the grave. Back in 1983, Nathaniel Reed had been a terrified green 22-year-old first lieutenant thrust into a covert, highly illegal operation in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Central America. His unit was compromised on day 2. Pinned down in a ravine, outnumbered 10-1, and rapidly running out of ammunition, death was not merely a possibility. It was a rapidly approaching certainty. The radio operator was dead. The extraction chopper was grounded due to anti-aircraft fire, but Harrison Caldwell was their sergeant major. Harrison wasn't a man who commanded from the safety of a fortified radio tent. He was a terrifying force of nature, a phantom in the underbrush who moved without a sound. When the evacuation helicopters officially refused to enter the hot zone, Harrison had defied direct, explicit orders from high command to surrender. He took 2 men vanished into the dark tree line and waged a brilliant psychological and physical war against the encroaching enemy forces. He systematically dismantled their perimeter, creating a massive, fiery diversion that allowed Reed and 12 other wounded men to slip through the dragnet under the cover of smoke and darkness. Harrison took a rifle bullet to the left shoulder and heavy mortar shrapnel to his right hip during the final exfiltration. He had carried a heavily bleeding Doc Henderson for 3 agonizing miles through a waist-deep swamp, bleeding the entire way, refusing to leave a man behind. "I read the declassified briefing on Operation 041 last week," General Reed said, his voice tightening, pulling Harrison back to the present. "The Pentagon is finally scrubbing the red ink off the 1980s files. It is taking a literal act of Congress to push it through, but they are doing it." Harrison frowned deeply, his bushy grey eyebrows knitting together over his slate-grey eyes. "They should leave the files buried. The past belongs in the dirt, Nathaniel. It does nobody any good to dig up old graves." "The past is the foundation of the present, Sergeant Major," Reed countered softly, leaning forward. When they declassified the operational logs, the intelligence analysts at the Department of Defense couldn't comprehend the casualty reports. They couldn't understand how 14 men survived a heavily coordinated 400-man ambush in the jungle. Reed leaned closer, his eyes intense and bright. "I had to explain it to the Secretary of Defense personally. I had to sit in his office and tell him about the man who held the line." Harrison looked away, staring out the rain-streaked window into the grey Fayetteville morning. "You talk way too much, Nate. Always did. You were a mouthy lieutenant." "And you never talked enough," Reed replied firmly. "When we finally got back to base, you took the entire fall for disobeying the extraction protocols. You swallowed the court-martial threat to protect my career and the rest of the unit. You let those bureaucrats strip you of your pension, your honors, and your dignity, just so a young Lieutenant Reed wouldn't catch a dishonorable discharge. You vanished into the civilian world, taking the blame so we could keep our uniforms. Cassidy pressed her trembling hand to her mouth, tears openly welling in her eyes and spilling over her cheeks. The quiet old man in the corner, the one who quietly tipped her exactly $2 every morning, the one who endured the cruel mockery of arrogant kids without a whisper of protest, had sacrificed his entire life to save the man currently running the United States Army Forces Command. It was a tactical decision, Harrison stated coldly, though his trembling, arthritis-ridden hand betrayed his profound emotion. You were a commissioned officer. You had a future in this military. I was just a tired old dog who had seen too much blood. The Army needed you, Nate. They didn't need me anymore. You're wrong, Reed said, his voice cracking with a fierce, unexpected vulnerability that shook the room. The Army always needed men like you. We still do. General Reed reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored dress uniform jacket. He pulled out a small, perfectly flat mahogany box. It was polished to a brilliant mirror shine, adorned with the heavy gold seal of the United States Department of Defense. He placed it gently on the cracked vinyl table, pushing it slowly across the aisle until it rested directly in front of Harrison's lukewarm coffee mug. Harrison stared at the beautiful wooden box as if it were an unexploded device. What is this, Nathaniel? A long overdue correction of the official record. Reed answered his tone, shifting back to that of a commanding officer, yet laced with deep, unwavering respect. When the files on Operation 041 were finally unsealed, I brought your specific actions to the immediate attention of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I detailed your technical insubordination, your unparalleled combat efficiency, and the undeniable fact that you single-handedly saved 14 American soldiers at the ultimate cost of your own career. Harrison tightened his jaw. I do not want a medal, Nate. I do not want a loud parade down Main Street. I just want to drink my black coffee in absolute peace. It is not just a medal, Reed said softly, tapping the top of the dark box. It is a restoration. Reed unlatched the mahogany box. The brass hinges clicked loudly in the silent diner. Inside, resting perfectly on a bed of rich, dark blue velvet, lay a heavy, gleaming piece of metal. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, the highest military award for extraordinary heroism in combat. Beside it lay something even more significant, a thick stack of official, heavily embossed government documents signed in fresh black ink. By direct order of the President of the United States, General Reed announced his voice, carrying effortlessly across the diner, demanding the absolute attention of every single soul in the room. Sergeant Major Harrison Caldwell is hereby retroactively reinstated to his rank with full military honors, full retirement pension, and all back pay owed from the date of his unjust discharge in November of 1983. A collective sharp gasp echoed through the diner. The sheer magnitude of the statement hung heavy in the air. Harrison closed his eyes tightly. A single heavy tear escaped the deep wrinkles of his eyelids, tracking a slow, agonizing path down his weathered cheek. For over 40 years he had carried the crushing weight of a disgraced soldier. He had endured the whispers, the grinding poverty, and the agonizing loneliness of a man who had sacrificed absolutely everything for a country that did not even know his name. "My wife!" Harrison whispered, his voice finally breaking into a fractured sob. "Martha died 10 years ago, thinking I was a failure, thinking I threw my entire life away over a foolish mistake." General Reed reached across the table, placing his large, powerful hand over Harrison's trembling, arthritic fingers. "Martha knew exactly who you were, Harrison. She saw the man behind the uniform. And now the rest of the world will know too." Reed stood up slowly. He meticulously adjusted his uniform jacket, ensuring every ribbon and medal was perfectly aligned. He looked around the diner. His piercing eyes swept past Cassidy, past the line cook, peering intently from the kitchen, past the silent patrons who had just witnessed a modern miracle on a dreary, rainy Tuesday morning. "This man," General Reed said, addressing the entire room, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "This man is the sole reason I am alive today. He is the reason 14 families have fathers, grandfathers, and sons. If you ever see anyone disrespect him again, if you ever hear anyone mock his service, you tell them they have to answer directly to me." The local police chief nodded very solemnly. General Reed turned back to Harrison. The powerful commander stood at rigid attention and raised his hand in a flawless salute. Harrison looked down at the medal. He took a deep breath. Slowly, painfully, the veteran stood up. His hunched posture completely vanished. He raised his hand and returned the gesture. "Dismissed, General." Harrison rasped. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." The faded ink on an old man's arm proved that true heroes don't wear their courage for applause. They carry their sacrifices in silence. Harrison's incredible story reminds us that respect should never be judged by appearances alone. If this powerful tale of honor, brotherhood, and a 4-star general's ultimate tribute moved you, please hit that like button, share this video to honor all the silent veterans among us, and subscribe for more unforgettable real-life stories.